So as you can see behind me, maybe not the typical pictures that you would associate with a Sunday morning, but we are starting a brand new study beginning this week on the book of 1 Corinthians in the New Testament. And 1 Corinthians it's a trek. In my mind, 1 Corinthians is probably one of the top 2 or 3 most difficult books for me to understand in the New Testament. And so this has forced me out of my comfort zone into a lot of research to present, to figure out myself better and to present to you what I think are maybe some plausible reasons why Paul says some of the things that he does to the Corinthian people in this letter. And so we're going to go on a journey together. And some weeks you might think, well, I don't know if I agree with what Jason says. This isn't something where I'm going to tell you the right answers about everything, but I'll tell you what I've found. And so this is more of a springboard for you to explore this book as well, knowing that there are some very tricky things where very well-educated scholars disagree on. And so this will be good for us, I think, to work through this book. But there are going to be some things that I think are very practical for us as well. And I've titled this series Honor versus Humility, because I feel like looking at the book, if you boil everything down, people then, and maybe people today, we really want kind of honor for ourselves in a lot of ways. But when you look at Jesus, and especially when you look at the cross and the significance and the symbolism behind how the cross was Jesus' way to provide salvation and forgiveness to humanity, and it was the way to really walk into this kingdom, this eternal kingdom. It wasn't through honor. It was through something that was devastatingly humble. I would say humiliating would be a good word. It shows us how God's idea of the way of living life is completely opposite of the way that we tend to operate naturally as people. And so with the Corinthians, Paul is going to be challenging their cultural ideas. And they are very much the picture that you see on the left, where it is all about honor in that culture. And we'll talk about that more as we progress through this series as well. It's all about elevating yourself, even if you have to step on a few other people around you, because you have to do that to get ahead in society, and everyone's pushing for that. But yet when you look at Jesus and the cross, it's a very different way of life, and it's very hard when everyone around you in your culture is saying one thing. And so maybe we'll find some parallels for us. Maybe we'll be forced to ask what everyone around us in our cultures, whether you live here, whether you live in other places in this country or around the world, wherever you call home, chances are your culture says certain things about life. And if you look at the way Jesus teaches, it's going to be very, very opposite, which makes it very hard to live out those ways of Jesus where you are, because most of society is pushing in a completely different direction. So I think it'll challenge us to reevaluate how we see life in our culture as well as we get on this journey. But I want to begin just with, this is a letter. 1 Corinthians is a letter written from the Apostle Paul to a church in a city called Corinth, and we'll get some background on where that city is located and what it looks like in just a moment. But it is a letter. And so we only have half the conversation. If you wrote me a letter and somebody else read it, they would have no idea about maybe what I thought or what I had asked you or the situations that prompted that letter. So we have to do a little bit of investigating to try to piece together why we think Paul said the things he said, what kinds of questions we think the Corinthian church was asking him, and what their situation was like. And so we have to do some detective work and some guesswork, honestly, in certain areas to try to figure out why this letter is addressing the things that it is. So it'll be a little challenging. But every letter in the New Testament world, in the Roman world, is started off with a greeting. And so Paul starts his letters off with greetings as well. And I think the greeting will help us figure out maybe some of the issues Paul's going to talk about as we get into this. But just like you would maybe say, greetings, or to whom it may concern, in a couple of lines of introduction, this is how Paul addresses his letter. It's a common form of beginning a letter in the ancient world. It says, Paul called. The word called, when you come across that, it basically means he's invited as an apostle, as somebody sent out of Jesus Christ by the will of God. So he says, Jesus Christ invited me to go out, to be sent out as a representative of him. And that was part of God's will. That's why I'm writing you, and we'll find later that's why Paul actually came to Corinth in the first place. He was the one who established the church, the local community of Jesus followers in the city of Corinth. He says, and our brother Sosthenes. So Sosthenes is somebody else who is with Paul, possibly somebody who came from Corinth and informed Paul of some of the questions the Corinthian believers had or some of the issues and the struggles they were dealing with. Maybe somebody who had it on his heart for Paul to write a letter and give them some guidance and advice. But he's somebody who's familiar to Paul and also this group of believers in Corinth. He says, to the church of God, which is in Corinth, to those who have been sanctified. Sanctified is this, it's also translated holy in the Bible, but it's this idea that you've been separated for close contact with God. So in the Old Testament temple, the priests or some of the utensils or the tables or the bread, they were sanctified or consecrated or set apart to be close to God, to God's presence. And so Paul's saying, God has separated you through Jesus to come into a closer relationship with God in Christ Jesus. Saints, which is another form of that word sanctified, just means people who they kind of deserve special honor because of their close contact with God. So Paul is kind of alluding to the fact that they need to be concerned about how they're treating each other in the church, because there are some ways that they're willing to walk all over each other in this local church. And we'll find out more about that in the weeks to come. By calling or invitation, so they were invited into this close relationship with God as well. With all who in every place call on the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, their Lord and ours. So Paul's also broadening it out and saying it's not just you. This morning, as we look around at people here, we can know, I met a family before the service who's visiting the States from Germany. And it's just a reminder that people are following Jesus all over the world. And so Paul is telling this group, you're not the only church. You may be the people who are following Jesus in Corinth, but Jesus' church has made its way around different parts of the Roman Empire by this point. This is about 18 years to 20 years after the time of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, when the church in Corinth is started. Then a few years after that, when Paul's writing this letter. And so by that time, the church has spread. A lot of different cities in the Roman Empire have a local church cropping up. He says grace, which is God's good fortune or God's blessing or God's benefit to you, and peace, rest, harmony, safety, that idea from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. That's a common greeting from Paul to all these churches. I wish God would extend his grace, his blessing on you, good fortune on you, and that you would have rest and harmony and safety. But we'll see they didn't have harmony and they didn't have rest in this church, because there was a lot of conflict happening between people in this church, a lot of competition happening in this local church. And all these things, they may be different scenarios than what we're facing here at Mountain View Bible Church in Laverton, Utah. But some of the things may cross over. And some of the things, at times, we might deal with these issues and have to refer back to this book for a little bit of advice, albeit advice that happened a long time ago that we may have to kind of use in different ways in our cultural context today. And so I want to give you today a little bit of background information about Corinth, because if you jump into 1 Corinthians, it's going to get really, really confusing if you don't know a few basic things about their history and their society. This will help. This won't answer all the questions. We'll have to get into more minute details as we move along, but this will at least give you an idea for what things were like, sort of, in ancient Corinth. So here's a little bit of information for you. Quick history lesson. Corinth, it was an ancient Greek city-state. Been around for, thousands of years before this point in 146 BC. At one point in time, there were, I think, 40,000 or 90,000 residents. I think it was 400 BC, there were around 90,000 residents in ancient Corinth. So it had been a huge Greek city-state. But they came into opposition with Rome, and Rome dropped the hammer on them in 146 BC, destroyed the city, killed all the men, sold all the women and children into slavery, completely wrecked the town. Then they decided, a little over 100 years later, in about 44 BC, this place, Corinth, this could benefit us as an empire. It's a very strategic location, and we could make a lot of money from Corinth. So let's rebuild it. Julius Caesar, shortly before he was killed, he decided to rebuild the city. And so this is a little geography lesson. The yellow area is Greece today. And if you see Greece, it's two sections, right? There's that lower area that looks like an island that's called the Peloponnesus. Then there's the northern area to the top, which is mainland Greece. And if you look a little bit past the center, just slightly off to the right, there's a tiny strip of land that connects the Peloponnesus with mainland Greece. And Corinth is right in the middle of that. Zooming in a little bit closer, you can see there's a couple names for Corinth. One is right on the bay. That's a newer Corinth, but the old Corinth is down slightly from that, kind of in the middle of that connection, that isthmus that connects the Peloponnesus with northern Greece. And so it wasn't on harbor. And so what they decided to do is that there was a harbor just to the north, and then the west of that, and one to the southeast. Cenchreae was to the southeast. I think it's Lycona was to the north, and you can see those dots right on the seas. The Aegean Sea is one of the seas there, and the Adriatic Sea. And so what Rome decided to do was to rebuild Corinth, and then they had roads going to both of those port cities. So now they could control trade. Because if you go back a couple of pictures here, to sail around southern Greece, especially in half of the year, the winter months of the year, was very, very treacherous, not to mention a longer journey. So what people would do, they would skirt that, and they would cross that small strip of land right where Corinth was. They would unload their cargo, and if the ships were small enough, sometimes actually roll the ships on rollers across that section. I think it was 12 miles or something of land. But especially the cargo, they would haul that across the land and then put it in a different ship on the other side and keep going. So that was right in the middle of a trade route. So Rome knew if they rebuilt that city, they could get all kinds of tariffs from the trade that went through there, and they could also effectively set up, a center for trade and markets and business in that area. And so that's what they wanted to do, was control that trade center. It was between those harbors. Another key feature of this is it was the connection point between Italy in the west and Asia in the east. If you wanted to go between those continents, you would typically sail from Italy through that area, cross the land at Corinth, get into another ship, and then you would head off into Asia in the east. And so it was a very, very strategic point. There was fertile farmland, and they already had this tradition happening that the Greeks started called the Isthmian Games. We've heard of the Olympic Games. And the Isthmian Games were just another form of competition. They had poetry readings, they had musical performances, they had horseback races, chariots, races in full armor, and foot races, wrestling and boxing. And then this crazy event where you had to ride on one horse, and then while the horses were in motion, jump from one horse to the next horse and keep going. And so every 2 years they had those competitions, which brought in tourism, which brought in money, which brought in entertainment, and they devoted those games to the gods, and they decided to worship the victors as heroes often as well. And so this became a huge money maker for Corinth. Here's another interesting thing that happened with that city. Rome decided when they rebuilt the city, because they had killed the original inhabitants off, there were a few Greek people in the countryside surrounding that remained, but it was basically decimated. They decided, when we rebuild this thing, we're going to be strategic. We're going to bring 1,600 men and their families from all over the Roman Empire, from Egypt, from parts of Asia or Turkey, from Italy, all around the empire. So we get this really diverse group of people. But we're going to bring freedmen, people who have been freed from slavery, because we can kind of hang over their heads the threat of, like, if you don't toe the line and you don't rebuild this the way we want it rebuilt, we'll just put you back into slavery. So we're going to bring freedmen over and their families. And at the same time, instead of doing what we do throughout the entire Roman Empire, where to have positions of power and authority and to be somebody, you have to come from a family who's always been somebody and have the right family heritage and connections. In this city, we're going to do things different. It's not going to be about family status. It's going to be about everyone for themselves. And so we're going to give these freedmen the opportunities to advance. And so it was one of the few places in the Roman Empire where you could come and make a name for yourself and achieve greatness, even if you were, from the past of slavery. This was very, very attractive. And so, like I said, those initial inhabitants came. They set up this city. It was formed in squares. They had very organized ways of developing the city out, and they populated it with these people and then said, hey, The people who do the best jobs will get promoted to the best positions, and then from there on, they started to develop their own system of networks and connections and use the trade to acquire wealth and gain more positions of power. But it was available for anyone who came there. And so people began to come there over the next several years, from other parts of the empire. So it's very diverse in culture and very much cutthroat and competitive and do anything to get ahead, because it was one of the very few places in the Roman Empire where you had that kind of an opportunity. This is a little bit of a visual of what things looked like. In the middle, there's an agora, a marketplace, also called a forum, and that would have been the hub for trade. As you can see kind of in the diagram, there's a small road that's not so small up in close person that heads out to one of the harbors, and there would have been another road out the other side of the city that headed to the other harbor. In the center of town was the forum, the marketplace. It's actually almost as big as 2 football fields. So it's a huge marketplace. Also, you see that red roof there. There's a temple to Apollo. There's a temple to Octavia, who is the wife of Caesar Augustus, as we'll talk about in a moment. The official religion of all these Roman colonies, all these Roman cities, was emperor worship. And so they, in this city, revered Emperor Caesar Augustus, who had passed away, before that point in time. He was around during the time of Jesus' birth, and also his wife. And so there was an elaborate structure where on his birthday every year they came to worship. But it was common throughout the Roman Empire to worship the emperor. That was a state religion. Here's another picture, and it has just some temples that were in the center of town. Temple to Apollo. You can see the forum is that large square as well. But a lot of the buildings where the city officials would meet and where judgments took place, they were all in the city center. They had a covered theater. They had an open Greek amphitheater in the center of town to accommodate the tourists and maybe bring some of the Isthmian games into those facilities as well. And so, again, it was a very built up, a very intentionally driven toward making money kind of place. This is part of the agora and part of the street. You can see the tiny people there, so it's not a small area, right? Just to give you some background. That mountain you see in the back is called the Corinth. That's where the Greek Corinth existed before Rome decimated it. It was very well defendable and fortified, being on the hill. There was a small temple to Aphrodite that was up there, the goddess of love and beauty. But in this case, she was seen as the protector of the city. And so the Romans retained and rebuilt the temples to the Greek gods and goddesses as well, because every god and goddess kind of had their own area that they were responsible for, and Rome wanted to make sure they covered all the bases and didn't offend any of the gods or goddesses. So they rebuilt these Greek temples and even built some Egyptian temples as well in the city. So a lot of worship. This is another angle on the agora. This would have been what a stall looked like in the marketplace. They had archways, and so underneath the archway, you would have your little shop. Paul would have probably sold tents under one of these with Aquila and Priscilla, and then there would have been a roof over everything, and so you would have had arch after arch after arch, and shop after shop after shop, all the way around the edges of this agora, this marketplace. And then people could do trade in the middle, or maybe put up tents or things like that as well. Probably a fountain in the middle of that. And so that's what it was like. Rome ruled Corinth through the Senate. This is unique. They had some local officials that you could work your way up to being, but they didn't send any procurators or things like that from Rome to be official leaders. They brought the leaders, they developed the leaders from within the city, and then the Senate in Rome had ultimate say over decisions. They also had hardly any military presence in Corinth, because when you have soldiers everywhere, it's a good way to push away the tradespeople and the tourists, right? We don't want to come across as just overly militarized, so in this town, we're not going to do that. How would you motivate people to obey your empire if you didn't have a military to scare it into them? What do you think? Profit? Okay, any other thoughts? So there's an incredible opportunity to make money, which is part of it. But another part of it was a lot of the people who are there are former slaves who have gained their freedom in their Roman citizenship. And so by nature of the fact that it's so competitive, if somebody doesn't follow what you want, you just ruin their reputation. You take away their honor, and they either get abased, or worst case scenario, you put them back into slavery. And so you can always hang that threat over people's heads, and you don't need to have a military to do that because of the way that the society was based. And so it was a very unique place in the Roman Empire. Here's a little bit about society. Again, I'm just covering a few of the details this morning. We'll get into things that fit specific chapters or parts of the book, the letter, as we go on. But status and honor were prized and highly pressured above everything. So how people view you is the most important thing in the world. In our culture, this is different. Some of you could care less what someone else thinks of you, right? I'll post whatever I want on my social media, and who cares if people hate me for it, right? Who cares if people mock me? Like, I'm going to be myself. I don't care what other people think. That's very maybe modern in the Western world way of thinking things. But that would have been totally foreign in ancient Corinth. And so we have to kind of undo our brains in that way and step into this world. As kids grew up, they were educated. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey formed a lot of the foundational ideas for their literature, and then they had a lot of Greek philosophers and early Roman philosophers and orators as well, whose works would have been read and kind of idealized through that. And those works emphasized heroes. Now, your hero might be somebody like who wins an important game, or somebody who's great in your field, or somebody who just does something, in the face of all odds. But if you were living in ancient Corinth, your hero, first of all, your hero is a man, all right? That's what all the stories taught you. Your hero was intelligent, and your hero was handsome. Your hero could speak very well in public and debate. And your hero was a warrior, somebody who was strong enough and big enough and intimidating to win all their battles. Somebody who pursued honor, their own honor, and avenged their dishonor or shame at all costs, even up to their life. Okay? That was the pinnacle of what people were striving for. Okay, that was the goal. And so there were different ways that you could gain more honor for yourself. But life was all about gaining the most honor. This really is foreign to us. Because some of you, again, you could care less about that. But you have to step into the mind of the people. Otherwise, a lot of what's said in 1 Corinthians makes no sense or just seems weird to us. But when you think about this, how honor was driving everything, it causes more things to make sense. And so here's how you got more honor. One, your family lineage. Although that didn't play so much of a part in Corinth, right? Because some of these people had come from a line of slavery. So that didn't matter as much here. The social positions of your friends and your acquaintances. Who you knew was everything. And even to the point where there was a system called a client-patron relationship. So if you wanted to get ahead in society, what you would do is you would become close friends with somebody who was 1 or 2 steps ahead of you, who had a little bit more or a lot bit more money, who would sponsor you, and you would serve them or perform tasks for them or do different things for them, and in turn, they would have a friendship with you. They would invite you over for meals. They would give you money if you didn't have enough money for things. And it was always expected that you were kind of indebted to do things that they asked you to do, right? And eventually you could work your way up and maybe be on the same level as they were. Or maybe you'd get an opportunity to humiliate that person. Maybe they'd slip up. And you could find a flaw in them when you had advanced enough and you had enough of your own means, or maybe you had made more in the marketplace and you had more wealth to do so. You could just stomp on them in public. You could take them to court and win a case. You could insult them. You could point out something that was happening in their life, and you could get ahead. And that's kind of what life was like. Wealth was a way of stepping up, and so having that huge agora marketplace where all the trade, most of the trade that went from east to west in the empire was passing through that city. So very wealthy, lots of opportunities to make money through your businesses. Land ownership was a way to get up. Holding civic offices, again, gaining higher status and being awarded offices, not based on your birth or your family, but because you would gain more status in that specific city. Additionally, having more slaves than people, having more clients who depended on you for money and reputation, and then having a great house and wonderful possessions. Some of those things aren't so foreign from us today, right? I mean, those things, sometimes we look at people with some of those items and go, they've arrived. So in that sense, maybe we can relate to Corinth. But these things could be lost again at any moment in time through offending someone, through causing public shame, especially if you were depending on somebody higher up the food chain. If you did something they didn't like or offended them or caused them shame, they would hang you out to dry in a heartbeat. They would put you down, they would ruin their reputation, and you'd be back at ground zero trying to start over again. So as people were competing and everybody wanted to get ahead, even if they had to put you down to do so. And you're trying to do the same thing to other people as well. If you go to court, all the judicial systems, they're not impartial, they're biased. If you're higher in status, the judges are going to prefer you. Because again, maybe they're indebted to you in some way in the society. You can't take anyone to court over anything unless you're higher in status than they are. And so here's how courts are going to work. You're going to take somebody lower than you in status in society to court, and you're going to win because you have a higher status. Or you're going to take somebody who's on an equal level with you to court to try to get ahead. Because if you win, it makes you look better and them look worse. So you go up and they go down. But there's always the gamble that you might end up, looking worse and losing, and they might be elevated. But that's why the court system exists in this town. It's not for justice. It's for advancement, or to put other people down even a little bit lower, or to show how much better you are than other people and gain honor. Work, politics, religion. In Western culture today, there's some separation between that. In this culture in Corinth, there is zero. And so work and politics and religion are inseparable. Your job, if you do any kind of trade in the marketplace or whatever, there's a trade association in that town that if you want connections, you're going to be a part of. And that trade association, people in that association who are higher up in status than others, they're going to sponsor these meals. But all these meals are going to take place at dining rooms outside the local temples, and they're all going to begin with sacrifices to specific gods or goddesses in the city. And so it's all intertwined. Part of the workplace is going to be dining at the temple where sacrifices are offered to different gods. City officials, they are expected to sponsor emperor worship. And so any kind of city function is going to either be tied to the emperor and giving him worship or a sacrifice, or at different times of the year celebrating festivals to these different gods or goddesses who are throughout town. Even the Isthmian Games are going to be dedicated to a god or a goddess. And so you can see the kind of just difficulties that early Christians who are trying to follow Jesus instead of Caesar as the Lord might begin to experience, right? Definitely opportunities to compromise. Sorry, I missed on my slides on these, but religion. Polytheism, worshiping many gods or goddesses, this is normal. Here are just some of the temples who are around. There's Isis, who's an Egyptian goddess. This Isis is responsible for sails, like sails for ships, and guardian of the seas. Given the close proximity with harbors and trades, you can see why there's a temple to Isis. Osiris, who is Isis's spouse, is the Egyptian god of the afterlife and resurrection. So right at the harbor, there's a temple to this god and goddess. Temple of Apollo, it's in the center of town, the god of youth and beauty and athleticism. You can imagine why that would be there. One, the Greeks founded it and the Romans, rebuilt it, but also with the Isthmian Games, of course, Apollo is going to be a part of things. Temple of Aphrodite, again, seen as the protector of the city. This is the remains of the temple to Isis on the harbor. Again, just want to give you a feel for how decimated things are today. There are a lot of earthquakes that happen in this region, and Corinth was destroyed many, many times throughout history by earthquakes. And so the remains today are not super spectacular due to that. This is a reconstruction of what the temple to Apollo probably looked like. It's what it looks like today. A little bit of difference. History does that. Sanctuary of Asclepius, the god of healing. This is interesting. I have something to show you in a moment. Sanctuary of Demeter, goddess of harvest and agriculture, because they had a lot of fertile land around there that they farmed to support that city and all of its tourism and commerce that happened there. And then Kore, the queen of the underworld, goddess of springtime. So those were more agricultural goddesses. Sanctuaries of Poseidon at both harbors, because he's the god of the sea, right, with the trident. And then the statue, of course, to divine or god Augustus, the Caesar, and then the temple to his older sister. So that's what things were like. So if you're going to worship at the sanctuary of Asclepius, the god of healing, the way that you do that is by making a clay copy of the body part that's ailing you, and you bring it to the temple and you present it for worship. And so archaeology has uncovered all of these clay body parts that people brought. They would stay overnight or longer if necessary sometimes at the temple or around the temple to be healed, to experience healing by the god Asclepius. There's just the remains of one of the other temples in town as well. I think that's the one to Octavia, Augustus's older sister. And then there would have been a statue to the divine Augustus. It's no longer there, but it would have looked something like this. Just another area of the forum close to where the judgments took place. There was a Jewish synagogue that existed in the city. We know that because of what we read in Acts. Acts describes Paul establishing this church in Corinth in chapter 18, which we'll conclude with in just a second. And then there's another event that happened in Rome in 49 AD 49. Emperor Claudius, he expelled all the Jews from Rome. And so we know Priscilla and Aquila, they landed in Corinth and started making tents with the Apostle Paul there at the marketplace. But it was very likely because of its position between east and west, right on the trade routes, that many of these Jews who were expelled out of Rome probably landed, at least for a while, in the city of Corinth as well. And so the Jewish synagogue probably got an uptick in its membership during this period of time, which again is within about a year of the time that Paul arrived and began arguing for Jesus in this Jewish synagogue. We actually have a couple fragments. This is a lintel above a door. It says Synagogue of the Hebrews, part of it in Greek. And then this is a column from a pillar that has menorah on it. So we know there's a synagogue that was there in the town. And Paul established an early community of Jesus followers. Around AD 50, there's a reference to who was proconsul, or like the one who had gotten to be in a position of being in power in the city. And we can reference that historically with other inscriptions. And so we know right around 50 AD is when Paul rolls in and starts the church. Here's the last thing I want to leave with you. I'm not going to expound on this, but I just want you to know how the church got off the ground so that you have that as a background when we get into the letter. So I'll read this and then we'll close this morning. It says, Paul left Athens and went down to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, what I just spoke about. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, Paul was, he stayed with them. And they worked together, for they were tent makers by trade. People, again, bought tents. People who came to watch the Isthmian Games, people who were, trading, people who were in between places or had just come to the city for a while. So it was a very necessary trade. And Paul was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word. So assuming he stopped making tents and he just starts speaking and trying to argue for Jesus or persuade people about Jesus. Testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ, was this king that they've long anticipated, was God in the flesh. But when they resisted, organized themselves against like an army is the idea behind that. They resisted like in an organized way. They were combating Paul, the Jews were, and they blasphemed him. They attacked Paul's character and his motives. He shook out his garments and he said to them, "Your blood's on your own heads. I'm clean. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles, the non-Jews in the area." So when you shake your clothes out, it's an Eastern way of saying, "I'm through. I don't have any part in this any longer." It says, then he left the synagogue and he went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. So he moves into a home in the area. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, as they listened to Paul, were believing and they were being baptized. So the church is gaining traction. Not just Jewish people, but the Corinthians from all these different backgrounds. And the Lord said to Paul by vision at night, "Don't be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and don't be silent, because I'm with you. Nobody will attack you and harm you, for I have many people in this city." That's got to be refreshing, because everywhere Paul goes, he gets beaten on by people. And so for the Holy Spirit to tell him, "You're going to have rest and peace here for a period of time. Don't worry about people attacking you," must have been so encouraging for him. It says he settled there for 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, this is around AD 52, the Jews rose up together against Paul, and they brought him before the judgment seat off of the one side of the forum or the marketplace in some of those pictures that we saw earlier, saying, "This man is inciting the people to worship God contrary to the law." Perhaps the Roman law, possibly the Jewish law as well. We'll talk about why they might have brought this up in just a second, but it says, "But when Paul was about to open his mouth," so Paul's going to say something and defend himself, Gallio, the proconsul who was making this decision at the judgment seat, says, "If it were a matter of some crime or vicious, unscrupulous act, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about teaching and persons in your own law, see to it yourselves. I am unwilling to be a judge of these matters." So a lot of scholars think the reason why they brought this up was because the emperor at the time had given them a little bit of Jews. He'd given the Jews freedom to worship. And perhaps they were afraid that Paul, by adding these things, would disqualify the Jewish synagogue from that protection to worship as a unique religious entity in that city. So maybe that's why they were bringing it up. But obviously the proconsul could care less that some people, these Christians, have a few different ideas than the Jewish people do about their laws and maybe about who Christ is and things of that nature. So it says he drove them away. He pushed them away and said, I'm not dealing with this. But they all took hold of Sosthenes, he's the new leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. And yet Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. He just could care less about this stuff. Gives you a little picture of Gallio. Now Paul, when he had remained many days longer, took leave of the brothers and sisters and sailed away to Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. Paul first had his hair cut at Cenchrea. That's the port city, one of the port cities that Corinth is connected to, just a few miles away, where the trade goes through. He had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. We're going to assume an Old Testament Nazirite vow, because that's the one that involved having your hair cut. That's going to be interesting to navigate as well. There's a reason why I put that in here, because I think it'll come up in one of our conversations. So that's an overview. Just some basics. We'll get into some more in the coming weeks, but I want you to know a little bit about these people, how their city came about, and how they view life and society and interact with each other, because that's going to play a big part in what we talk about starting next week.